Hello and welcome to Podcast Pete's podcast, where I, the aforementioned Podcast Pete, talk about podcasts and podcasting, giving you real practical tips when it comes to making, publishing, marketing and monetising your podcast. If you've got a question or you just fancy a chat, you can get in touch on Twitter at PodcastPete2, also on Instagram as well, or you can always email the real podcastpete@gmail.com. So this week I want to return to something that we talked about a few weeks ago, which is marketing. As I say, we did an episode on it that I'll put a link to that in the show notes, and I said at the time, there's quite a lot to talk about, so we're not going to do it in one episode. We're going to come back. This is the second episode. So in the first episode, where we talked about great free ways to market your podcast, we talked a lot about social media platforms. We talked about choosing the right one, the use of hashtags, making sure that you're refreshing your feed or posting consistently. Because, believe me, the phrase out of sight, out of mind applies to podcasting as well, because there's so much choice out there with different podcasts that if a podcast maybe you've listened to, if they don't publish an episode every now and again, or if you don't see them on social media, they kind of drop away from your mind. They kind of fall out of your vision because there's so many other podcasts wanting to get in there and grab your attention. So once you've done all that, once you've done everything we talked about in the first marketing episode, what else is there? That's it. Surely you've promoted it. There you go. Podcast marketing done. Tick. No, of course it's not. There are still so many ways to promote your podcast. So for instance, when it comes to social media, there's the content. Because what a lot of podcasters I've been looking at, what they do is they'll post either a photograph of a microphone or a photo of their setup or the cover of their podcast, and just expect people to flock to listen. And it doesn't work like that. You've got to think, what else have you got? What else can you give? Because you're not just giving with the audio. You've got to give with the visual as well, particularly on platforms like TikTok, on Snapchat, Pinterest, and on Instagram. It's all about what can I see? What are my eyes doing? Not what are my ears doing? So one of the things you can do is use a site like Canva or Adobe Spark or Powtoon. And again, there's a myriad number of website apps I could point you to that will help you to create eye-catching graphics. So that will just shake things up a little bit and just really make your social media stand out. So whether it is a quote from one of your episodes, whether it is the reveal of a guest on an upcoming episode, whatever it is, those websites, Canva, Adobe Spark and Powtoon, they will allow you to create social media that will stand out a little bit. As well as that, what about something of a video? Just a short form, just a little video, maybe over your shoulder while you're prepping the episode, maybe whilst you're recording it as well, or getting ready to record. Because, as I've said before, the success of your podcast relies on the relationship between you and the listener. So if you show yourself a bit more and introduce yourself to the audience a bit more, they're going to get to know you. And that connection then will either begin or just grow stronger. And again, I know that for some people, being in front of a camera, it's their idea of a nightmare. And what I'm saying is, I'm not saying you need to perform for the camera. You're not doing anything to camera. You're just, setting the camera up, filming yourself while you're maybe making your notes, while you're typing out your arc, maybe while you're editing the episode, or while you're recording, the first few seconds of it. But you're not recording it to camera. The camera just happens to be filming. So set it going and then just forget about it. What you're doing is you're taking the listener behind the scene of the podcast. And just think as to how cool you find it when you get to see behind the scenes on something that you like, whether it's a movie, whether it's a TV show, whether it's your favourite artist in the studio, whatever it is, whether it's an athlete in training, whatever it is, it's always exciting and pretty cool finding out, how the sausage gets made and what goes on behind the curtain. And of course, whenever you're posting, just remember, always include a link to the podcast. Always. Never just post and go, hey, we've got a podcast. You post a link. If people like what they're seeing, then they may well like what they're going to hear. So give them that chance. Don't rob them of that chance. And as well as using things like Canva or Spark or Powtoon, you can also use other web apps, something like Headliner. And Headliner can help you create little audiograms for your podcast. So maybe not the entire episode, although you can do that on Headliner, but you can create just a clip, using a clip of your latest episode. Or using a clip, using your trailer and creating an audiogram of that. So if you want, create an audiogram of your trailer so it's something to look at as well as listen to, and also tag accounts in that you think are going to be interested. So again, if there's, the knitting podcast that we mention a lot, if there is that knitting podcast, tag in, the Wool Association, the local knitting club, a celebrity knitter. I think Julia Roberts is a kind of frantic knitter, or certainly used to be. But tag them in. Now, don't do it too often, because you just run the risk of annoying the person or the group that you're tagging in. But just every now and again, tag somebody in that you think is going to be interested, because you never know, they may share it. And there you go, whole new network that you didn't have access to that is getting their eyes on what you're offering as a podcast. Now, aside from posting things to market your podcast, think about conversations as well. Whether it's on social media, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or Reddit, there are groups that are talking about the subject that you're podcasting about. So join these groups. Get involved in the conversation. Again, don't go steaming in and start throwing around links to the podcast. Just get talking. So if you've, again, a knitting one, if you've joined a knitting group on Facebook, your first post shouldn't be, hey everyone, I've got a podcast. Please listen to this podcast. Because as we've said in the past, no one wants to be sold to, and no one likes being sold to. So don't do the hard sell. Join the groups. Get involved in the conversation. Think about how you feel when you meet someone and almost immediately they start talking about themselves and trying to get you involved in the thing that they're involved in. It's pretty irritating. When you've not asked for it, you've not invited it. Just talk. Debate, converse with the other members of the group, and then when it feels appropriate, mention the podcast and put a link up. The other thing you can do is guest on other podcasts. Podcasters are always looking for guests for their podcast. They're always looking for content. Perhaps you could be part of that content. Perhaps you could be one of those guests. Because the good thing about podcasting is that there's very little competition, because none of it's rooted in money. So whilst there might be other podcasts that are doing the same thing as you, you don't necessarily see them as competition because there's no money involved in it. So having the person that presents the other knitting podcast on your podcast isn't an issue in the way that it would be if it was, say, a business podcast, or if it was a TV show or a radio show on a commercial station. Because all that you're doing, you and this other podcaster, is enlarging both of your audiences and introducing you, and them, obviously, to a completely new group of people. And also, when you're looking for podcasts to be a part of, don't just stick to your own podcasting area. So, for instance, again, going back to the knitting podcast, you could look to be on another knitting podcast. And again, just going back to the guest thing, if you are in the UK, don't feel you can't look at podcasts in America or South Africa or Australia or, any other English-speaking podcasts. And if you're French, then French-speaking podcasts. Don't think that you have to stick to your own country. I've been on podcasts in America. I've been on a podcast in Australia. I've been on a few UK ones as well. It's fine and great, and it doesn't matter. Podcasting is completely global. But going back to your podcasting area, if you've got this knitting podcast, you could absolutely look to be on another knitting podcast. But what about looking at a crafting podcast? Because knitting forms part of that. What about a podcast that talks about different hobbies? That could go on it as well. A podcast where they talk to people who make clothes. Yep, if you've knitted a jumper, you can go on about it and, talk about how difficult it is to knit collars or whatever. Finally, as well as all of that, so creating eye-catching content, joining conversations online that talk about a similar thing, being a guest on other podcasts. You don't have to just be a guest on other podcasts, because there's other ways as well. You can talk to other podcasters about cross-promotions. Now, cross-promotions can be the other guest, you being a guest on their podcast. Sometimes they just want you to record a short audio clip for you to talk about your podcast. Sometimes they just want a copy of your trailer and they'll play that as part of their podcast. And vice versa, you would be expected to do the same. In the end, so much of the success of a podcast is down to the marketing. And in the early days, you have to do a lot of it. You have to really get out there and talk about it. Always be on the lookout for the genuine opportunities to tell people about your podcast. And don't forget the links as well. They should be putting it in their show notes to let people know where you are. Okay, that's all for this episode. The next episode will be the last one for 2020. I'm going to take a bit of a break over Christmas. In the meantime, you can get in touch on Twitter at podcastpete2, also on Instagram as well, or you can email us, therealpodcastpete@gmail.com. Don't forget, let me know, tag me in if you're starting your own podcast. I'll use my networks and really share the heck out of it and get the word out there. Happy podcasting, everyone. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.